to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Deepening Shadows Retirement Enclave by Bear 64. Come on, Miss Betty. Time to go see the good doctor. The large, busty nurse latched on to the elderly woman's chair and whisked her unceremoniously from the recreation room, where she'd been watching others play games she had until recently enjoyed. She felt off balance as they swept down the long corridor to the elevators. Betty could only observe. She had no means to resist or protest. She was no longer capable of speech. She could not walk or employ her hands as anything but uncoordinated blobs of flesh, much like a tiny infant. She could only take the seemingly indeterminable rides when the nurses came. Today it was the one she feared the most, Nurse Harris, a big woman who enjoyed watching any resistance to her will ground into dust by means of cruel corporal punishment on her charges. None that would be caught on camera, or even if they were, that would be reported. I see you are no longer fighting or even squalling. Good thing. I was getting tired of you. You're old. You should be relaxing. What the doctor does with you may hurt, but it's all for the best. You'll see. Betty was not reassured. She rose inside the boxy lift towards the apex of the tower. No plunges into deep basement levels for the good doctor. The one liked her moonlight streaming through large windows and a grand view from on high at the apex of the tower. Betty only wished to let her children, or even her slack-jawed grandchildren, know that the retirement community in which they'd fought to place her was not what it seemed. At last the light boop on the elevator speaker signaled their arrival. A low, pleasant, electronically synthesized voice informed them that they had arrived at the penthouse level. Betty's anxiety rose as the nurse wheeled her through a small maze of corridors and into an all too familiar examination room. The nurse simply pushed her into the room, left her facing the back wall, and turned to leave. She closed the door behind her ample derriere, with poor Betty left to have only the plain wall in front of her to view. A little drool escaped to one side of her mouth. She did not feel it. The drool and the loss of feeling were both side effects of her recent strokes, or so the medical records reflected. She was sure that strokes had been induced by the good doctor. She sat staring at the blank wall, an empty space that beckoned her sense and high mental functions to emulate the solid dullness before her. Is that a break in the pattern? She wondered. Yes, a slightly darker path just ahead. Maybe my imagination. Maybe I'm losing what's left of my mind. The walls were painted light gray, like fog. Within those mists, she saw that the dark patch began to resolve into a figure. She was startled from her reverie when the door opened and in walked the sinister Dr. Ham. That's what Betty called her in her mind. She thought the woman looked like a villainess from a tawdry spy novel. The woman was quite attractive, but she almost always wore a mask, and there was a notable scar high on her right cheek when she smiled. Her eyes crinkled pleasantly, while the scar glared and intimated her true nature. Betty wanted desperately to ask about the scar, to have a conversation, to do anything that would delay what was coming. I see you are anxious to get started, the good doctor greeted her. I'm afraid, despite your therapies and medication, your health continues to decline. my friend. I will examine you, and then we will proceed to the chamber for the experimental work. Don't you find it amazing that after all the feeling that you've lost since the stroke began, you can still manage to experience tremendous pain?" She did not cackle menacingly or even spread the sinister grin behind her mask. She simply stated facts in a warm, pleasant voice, soft, even buttery, Betty thought, yet there was iron behind it, a determination that would ignore the low, piteous wails Betty would soon emit. "I'm afraid poor Betty will soon be spent. One more session should do it," Dr. Deborah Ham sighed as she entered the relevant data. "Let's schedule her for 2 weeks from today. She will have regained what strength she may by then, and other conditions will be right. Who's next on the agenda?" P.A. Juanita Vega suspected that the good doctor already knew the name of the subject, but it was her duty to keep the woman happy. Troy Baker, a resident of the independent-housed 55-plus section. This will be his initial visit. Dr. Ham smiled at her friend. So short a time since Miss Betty lived in one of those. How quickly she faded under our sessions. We haven't had a male in a while. He will help with the process. Always seek balance or see oneself fail. Will start on him the same day we finish Betty. Please set up the preliminary meeting. Troy Baker, the silver-haired man who still carried himself erect, with shoulders squared, gave a curt nod and clicked his heels in an archaic gesture of introduction. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ladies. I've heard that the good doctor's treatments are extraordinarily efficacious, though I know of no particular condition for which I currently require treatment." Dr. Ham, sans mask, smiled pleasantly and reassuringly. Her preternatural white teeth glimmered and dazzled, and her eyes sparkled warmly. "When you arrived, we gave you a thorough examination, as you recall. At this point, I recommended that you undergo treatment to prevent several current conditions from becoming problematic. No doubt you will soon find yourself feeling more vigorous than ever." Troy smiled. "Oh, I assure you, I am quite vigorous. Just inquire with the ladies in the individual dwellings where I currently reside, and perhaps among some of your contact staff who helped with the cleaning and other functions." He took a seat, uninvited, and crossed his legs. He carefully wrapped his hands around the top knee and shrugged. All pretense of formality dropped. "Bottom line it for me, Doc. What are these conditions that may be exacerbated over time, which you can treat so effectively with preventative measures?" He gazed at the doctor and the P.A. expectantly. Dr. Ham was prepared for her presentation, if not for the demeanor of her intended patient. She presented an electronic pad with an X-ray image. "You see, Mr. Baker, we have some minor blockage in your aorta, easily cleared at this point. But if we allow it to remain as it is, the blockage will collect more mass and eventually cause congestive heart failure or a similar condition. It may even break apart and travel, leading to a stroke or a series of them." She disregarded his personal space and reacted to the touchpad in his hands and slid her finger to the next page. "Next, the initial and follow-up results of your prostate exam. As you can see, there's some minor inflammation and growth." Troy sat tranquilly while the good doctor completed her litany of soon-to-be dire health concerns for him. When Dr. Ham retrieved her pad from his lap, again uninvited, he grimaced. So, ladies, is that all you want from me today? Dr. Ham frowned in confusion. As I told you, Mr. Baker, we'd like to get started sooner on treating your conditions so that you will have a long and enjoyable stay here at Deepening Shadows. The man stood abruptly and again stretched to his full height and squared his shoulders. His smile returned, but his tone became mocking. My good doctor, I shall determine when my health deteriorates enough for your kind attentions. At that time, I shall inform your assistants, whom I am certain will in turn inform you. Until such time, I bid you adieu. With that, he walked briskly from the office and found his own way to the elevator. Juanita looked towards her boss. Should I follow and see if I can convince him to return? Dr. Ham considered for a moment. No, I think he may be a challenge for us. Vigorous, he calls himself. He is correct. I've never observed a man his age with so few health issues. He still has his original teeth at 93. This will require a more subtle approach. Men often fight getting treatments that are good for them. It's just that the name sounded so depressing, Georgia wheedled. Maybe we could just keep Mom for a while longer. See if the new medications help any. What's wrong with Deepening Shadows? Making sense with all the trees crowding around and the timber industry that created this city. The high-rise tower nursing home at the center of a patch of forest. Maybe why they picked that name. Maybe everything is in the shadow of that thing. It's on the western outskirts of the city where the sun sets. Maybe that's the reason for the name. He switched threads. Look, if we don't put her here, we have to go closer to the metro area. No one should have to go near that place. Your mom will love being able to see the trees when she's aware and can see out her window. He saw that reason would never prevail over guilt and switched to assailing his wife's emotions. Babe, I would love for her to keep staying with us, but with baby Hannah to watch and Brianna toddling around the house, it's a lot of extra work, or worry. That's 3 that we can't let out of our sight for too long. She keeps fading out, drifting in her mind. It's getting to be more often. She may, accidentally, mind you, hurt one of the kids. Georgia looked hard at her spouse, and he hurriedly attempted to assuage her anger. Well, she likes to hold the baby, and Hannah is still so young, so fragile. As far as that goes, if Brianna ran into your mom's legs, they could both take a bad fall. Look, this place is great. The pastor even recommended it. She'll be able to visit with her folks her own age when she's up for it. She misses her old social life. Georgia eventually gave a terse nod. I guess it won't hurt to look at the place. She'd be on the assisted living floors at first. If she has to have more attention, she won't have to change facilities, just move up to the nursing home levels. She did her best to convince herself that this was the right move. They were shortly led through a tour by Miss Riviera from the business office. Nurse Harris and Mr. and Mrs. Felton are here to look at accommodations for her mother. Sonia turned to the cautious couple. Nurse Harris has been with us from the beginning. She was the first RN on staff and helped design an operation of this location. At the quizzical look from Eric Felton, she added, You may have missed it in our literature, but this is just one of the facilities operated by Termagant Caregivers, our overshadowing corporation. Each facility is uniquely designed for the region in which it was placed. Our founders copied a few other entrepreneurs and adopted a business plan to serve smaller cities and larger towns. Too far from large urban centers, to allow families to remain in contact with their elder relatives. Each facility has its own name, so it's not always clear that we were a multinational chain. It's similar to a franchise model, but with corporate management to oversee each region. The model allows us to cut costs on the business side and focus on the care and well-being of our residents and their families. Less than an hour later, Georgia and Eric shook hands with Sonia as they took their leave to go home and prepare Georgia's mother, Mrs. Florentine Culler, to move to her new home. "We'll be seeing you next Monday. Her room will be ready with a welcome basket, and we'll see you all at orientation." Georgia had decided to like Miss Riviera. Thank you. Thank you, too, for finding the best way to fund this. She has good insurance and government supplements, but it's always a concern for us. We do okay, but with 2 kids. Well, thanks. See you then. My apologies, sisters. We wanted to start the new male subject this evening, even as we finished with Betty. Unfortunately, he has proved to be recalcitrant. Dr. Ham informed her coven by way of the screens that surrounded the inner sanctum of her tower. The local, lesser members who'd remained in the shadow during Betty's final moments had filed from the other room, dismissed before the inner circle convened. "All the better when he is brought to heel," one of the indistinct faces responded. Another queried, "Perhaps he might be better employed in another capacity?" Dr. Ham arched her brow. "Oh, and in what way, Sister Tanya?" She asked the question, though she anticipated the answer, one that she had already begun to consider. Tanya's indistinct features inclined in a bow of acknowledgment. "While a pleading sacrifice tastes best to the Dark Towers, perhaps one that had been broken from a strong spirit. A strong spirit be made welcome. We are currently without a male as the 7th for our inner circle. Would this be one use? Do you think?" Dr. Ham pretended to consider the question, as though it had been the first time it had crossed her mind. "The only concern, that is, he is exceptionally old to get started. He is very sound. We might be able to get a good decade from him, or more meaningful numbers of years, should we decide. I would have to carefully broach the subject with him. He's very well educated, perhaps not tied too strongly to the silly belief of most of his peers. I will give it a try, if we all agree." Troy rounded on the bulky personage who attempted to loom over him in the assisted living lobby of the tower. "As I have explained, Nurse Harris, I am on no prescription medications. I do not trust them. I never have, and I refuse to begin simply to keep you content. As you know, Mr. Troy, everyone has to be vaccinated to enter residential areas in the tower. We will not make exceptions. Besides, Ms. Cutler has her condition won't allow us to let her have unsupervised visits." Troy stretched to his full height, and in that moment Nurse Harris had to look up at him, a rare occurrence in her lifetime of being an intimidator. "That's all you had to say. We could have avoided the entire unpleasant discussion," he grated. He turned to stalk towards the elevators, and once he'd hit the down button, he turned back to face the nurse who liked to oppress the most helpless residents. "In the future, you shall address me as Dr. Baker. Mr. Troy is condescending and rude. I would have accepted Mr. Baker without comment. It's a polite form of address. However, since you choose to assume a pedantic pose with me, I shall respond in kind." Before the elevator reached the floor, he favored her with a stern, lipless smile. "You don't fool me. The others tell me you're a dominatrix, a wretch, a tyrant, and a downright witch. Try that with me, and you shall find yourself in dire straits." The elevator booped, and the doors slid open, almost silently. He entered the car with a grace that belied his documented age, and the pleasant electronic voice announced that she was going down. Once the doors were closed, and he grinned and replied to the elevator, "Thanks for taking me with you, honey. Always loved a sweet ride." Nurse Harris was unsure whether to fume, to curse, or to swallow her rage and ignore this man who had pushed her buttons as easily as he had those of the elevator. Something about the man chilled her resolve to rule the tower with an iron fist, as she normally did. She postponed her decision as she continued her duties that day. She didn't have any special deliveries upstairs, and she ended up being reasonably pleasant to her charges during the rest of the shift, being too distracted to employ her normal coercive tactics. They, of course, felt even more trepidation. A happy Nurse Harris meant that some or all among them would suffer. "I wish you'd told us you were an MD as well as a PhD, Dr. Ham purred. "It may just be that we can offer you something to do that will be helpful to all of us." Troy looked down his aquiline nose at the woman who fancied herself a leader. He remained silent until she began to squirm. At the moment she opened her mouth to speak, he cut her short. "I wish to assess the facility before I said anything. Frankly, I find it wanting. The way you allow that beast of a Nurse Harris to abuse the patients is unconscionable. Several of your nursing staff are of a similar bent, hired by your senior RN, no doubt. The nature of your experiments are suspect by many in this facility, but if they know anything concrete, they remain silent for fear that they will receive special treatment next." He paused dramatically. "So what do you wish to offer? Your coven is not strong without a male to center the wills of the sisters. Did you mean to eventually breach the subject with me?" Deborah wasn't sure how to respond at first, but was quick on her mental feet. "So, you are aware of our society?" Troy made her wait for his response once more. He intended to gain her obedience, and this was part of the method experience had taught himself. Patient silence was intolerable for Delantes. "It's why I've come to this place. I wish to see up close how individual towers worked. I hoped it would provide some insight as to how the network of towers had come to dominate this niche of the elder care industry." "We don't like the use of the word industry. It makes us sound as though we are heartless." "You are heartless," Dr. Baker managed to thunder, while hardly raising his voice. "It is an industry, and has been for over a century. Tending to people's health should be very much an individual service. The criminal organization, formed by fraudulent insurance providers, avaricious pharmaceutical conglomerates, cowardly and inept providers, universities obsessed with social issues over science, and bloated bureaucrats clinging to perceived power, holds no more regard for human life than any other criminal cartel." He leaned forward and his voice lowered to just louder than a whisper. "I have been at my vocation for far longer than you can imagine." He leaned back and resumed normal conversational tones. All tension left his voice and demeanor. "I will consider your offer. Perhaps your motives are more decent than your methods. You're not the embodiment of your organization. However, I must know, Are you even aware of what Nurse Harris is?" Deborah cleared her throat and sat up straighter. "She's an RN and a foundling member of this tower. She's a voodoo bitch doctor." Troy silenced her once more with his low thunder. "Apparently, your tower covens accept witches of many disciplines. If one of her priests catches on to what she's doing," he shrugged, "probably wouldn't matter that much. Not the most organized of practices. Semantics aside, I will further investigate your operations, but tentatively, yes, I will act as your male contingent, provided we are conducting healing work." He stared hard into her eyes, searching for some reaction that might provide a clue to her genuine intentions. Based on her body language, she offered a silent response. "We always cure. In fact, we constantly research new remedies and therapies. As you said, we are a multidisciplined coven." Troy lurked in the shadows of the conference center on the penthouse level of the tower. He let his mind wander a little to happier times, while the witches carried on with their rites via screens. It was a new and, to his mind, unique manner for such gatherings to occur. Despite their concentration on chants and incantations, he was sure that many were distracted by his presence, even though they were physically remote. Like a ballet company, he mused, some ratio of male to female. His part in the ritual eventually arrived, and Deborah moved aside to allow him to stride to the center of the circle. He quickly found himself ensnared within the web of a standard pentagram. It was marked out on the floor in lights that glowed from beneath the otherwise plain black tiles. "Clearly they are not as opaque as I thought," he realized. He felt some trepidation. Pentagrams were so frequently employed because they were effective. Dr. Deborah Ham, glorious hair unbounded and flowing like a river, intoned her demands of the ensnared. "We bind thee with the name of the dark powers. Thou shalt do our bidding and answer our questions truthfully and completely." Troy assumed an expression of concentration and responded in the only way he was currently capable. "I shall for the duration of my captivity." He was angry that she'd included the command completely for his answer. It made provocation on his part nigh impossible. "We demand that you assist us in our endeavor to the best of your ability." Deborah continued, "You agreed to do so, and now we require your genuine acquiescence." "I shall do as you bid. You know that I must," Troy responded. Dr. Ham signaled that Nurse Harris wheeled in a pitiful figure who was strapped in a wheelchair and darting terror-filled glances in every direction. Florentine moaned in fear when she saw the dim screens arrayed in a circle with shadowy visages that glowed ominously from the depths of the monitors. She noted other forms in the deeper shadows on the room, each clearly prepared to pounce on her like cats on a small, weak rodent. She looked up in fear at the man who stood at the center of the circle. He looked to be strained and angry, perhaps a bit frightened. She recognized him as the man who had tried to see her earlier. She feared his presence. Perhaps he wanted to harm her then. Now he could clearly do so, with the help of many others. He looked her in the eye and smiled. "Miss Culler, my apologies that we meet under these circumstances. I assure you that I have been betrayed as much as you have been. Unfortunately, the result for you will be permanent if I understand the intent of this coven. Worse, they have coerced me into assisting them in their nefarious and likely murderous schemes." While he was exceptionally charming man, his words brought an even greater sense of menace to her current feelings. Deborah grew perceivably annoyed with his courtesies. "You shall desist from addressing the sacrifice until it is time, and then only as required." "I shall," Troy hissed. "You will assist us to the fullest of your abilities," Dr. Ham ordered her captive. "I shall," Troy intoned listlessly. "Now," Deborah continued, "Florentine color. You are to be the means for saving lives. We will draw the abundant good health you enjoy from you and dispel it among ourselves. Despite your wavering mental state, you have a strong essence, one that is worthy for us to covet. Be prepared for physical suffering. We cannot mute your pain. The powers we serve enjoy the taste of it. Tonight is only the beginning." She gestured again, and Sister Juanita fiddled with some controls. Shortly, an interior panel in the ceiling slid aside and revealed the moon rising towards apex. The beams of reflected light would shortly illuminate Troy and Ms. Color on their impromptu altar. Dr. Baker was elated at the infusion of light and the shadows it cast into the chamber. None of the other occupants of distant observers would have known from his expression. He was encouraged. Light lent him strength with which to resist his imprisonment, and shadows granted him the ability to apply subterfuge. That the ceremony continued, and despite his struggles to do otherwise, he found that he bent to the collective will among the gathered witches. He inflicted untold torments on the poor racked form before him, even as the coven members reveled in the infusion of energy they had received. Eventually it came to an end. The unfortunate Ms. Color now slumped in her chair. The process had drained more of her life than the witches had intended. She was completely spent after only one session. Dr. Ham looked to Nurse Harris. "You know what to do. It's been a long time since we had such an event. Ensure that she is placed carefully in her room, perhaps with some assistance from Sister Agnes and her skills with necromancy. You can create the semblance of life, long enough to allow witnesses to observe her demise." Nurse Harris bobbed her head. "Immediately, mistress." With that, she trundled the victim from the room. Deborah whirled on Troy. "You caused that. I did not command you to drain her essence completely." Troy offered a sardonic smile. "You required I assist to the fullest of my abilities." She was angry, but not overly concerned. She knew that Nurse Harris and Sister Agnes could easily handle the necessary subterfuge to keep the Felton family from discovering just how long their loved one had been deceased. Currently her venom was forced on the silver-haired form at the center of the circle. "To the other matters, then, since you wish to speak plainly. Tell us who you are and what purpose you serve." Troy's smile morphed into a feral grin that displayed his white and very sharp dentation. "I am what you see before you. I serve the purposes set by my masters and mistresses. They are myriad, eminently powerful, and beyond what you may demand of me." Deborah grew furious. Her lovely eyes flashed as she demanded, "Tell us your true name, then you will be bound to reveal all." All activity in the room ceased. The faces on the monitors froze, since the bodies behind them did the same, regardless of the remoteness of the tower. Light suffused the chamber, and Troy recited his true name. As he did, the pentagram dissolved. The faces on the monitors shriveled into desiccated remnants. The figures in the room shrieked and shrank into so many piles of ash and dust. Deborah, magnified eyes turned to glass, and her flowing hair fell from her head. Before she crumpled, she realized that the being's true name was a name of undoing. Her final regret dispersed with her life force. The monitor shattered, and many objets d'art, each of which was a symbol of the practice of their own, crumbled or bent or blazed in ruin. Eventually, Troy stepped out and away from where the pentagram had held him fast. He strolled elatedly to the elevators and soon descended to where he would finish his business at this facility. Miss Culler, I can see that you are actually and properly restored. The necromancer and the voodoo witch doctor did a good job. I couldn't save all of your essence, but what there is will last you a while. You won't recall this events of this evening, but you will be able to live a life free from your affliction, a much shorter life, but one that you will remember. Troy smiled at the woman who lay peacefully on her bed, eyes drooping in profound fatigue. Rest well and enjoy life when you awake. He looked over at the love seat designated for guests in the small room. The occupant would not have fit in the other chair. It was intended for a single occupant. The face that peered back at him was slack, the limbs limp, yet the eyes displayed wariness of their own surroundings. They reflected an abject terror of a bully brought to heel. As for you, Nurse Harris, when your colleagues finally locate you, there will be no cure for your stroke. You are too large a figure to put in a chair and be wheeled around. You will have to lie in your foul bed and fade over time, a longer time than you can imagine. With that, he left the room and stalked down the hallway. He still had work to do to complete the destruction of the other tower covens. He'd first have to track down and destroy Sister Agnes. He smiled in anticipation. That'll be fun. I've always detested necromancers. So quoth this raven. And have a lovely weekend, my darlings. Anyone else see an allegory to the U.S. absolutely stupid, incompetent, greedy healthcare system? Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.